Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to my latest MTG Arena Contender video series. It's been quite a while since I recorded some MTG Arena content, and with all the changes, new announcements for organized play support for MTG Arena and a bright future ahead of us, I'm gonna play some more MTG Arena going forward and also plan on covering it some more again, and also probably streaming it some more alongside Eternal and Artifact. Okay, so today I want to talk about a deck that is kind of near and dear to me, because it's a really old school style deck that I think is a lot of fun to play and that is viable again in Magic after years. It's basically kind of like old school style Magic, and it's mono blue fish or mono blue tempo, whatever you want to call it. The name fish is a bit misleading with Merfolk these days, but goes back to a similar style of deck from the past that was called this way for a reason that I'm not exactly familiar with. Anyway, let's take a look. Okay, so this is the deck. It's a mono blue tempo deck, not to confuse with an aggro control deck. This is very much a tempo deck, a proactive deck, not an aggro control deck. This deck cannot really play control. This is almost the exact same main deck as Gabriel Nassif and a bunch of other French people, I think, played at the last Standard Pro Tour. I think it was Pro Tour Dominaria, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, this deck is pretty sweet. It's not quite a top deck. It's not that popular, but it is a pretty cool and pretty competitive deck. One of them even, I think, went 10-0 in the constructed portion with it. So the deck definitely has what it takes to compete with the top dogs in the format. And I basically only made one minor change for the best of one. I cut the one-off Exclusion Mage for the Force Warkite Marauder, because I feel like in best of one you want to be more efficient and more proactive. And Exclusion Mage is kind of a bit situational and more of a card in the main deck that is part of the sideboard plan, because there are more in the sideboard. And if we don't have a sideboard, I rather wanted the Force Warkite Marauder main, where they ended up having the Force Marauder in the sideboard together with some more Exclusion Mages and just slightly streamline the deck. Okay, let's talk about the cards. First off, we have Mist-Cloaked Herald and Siren Stormtamer as our 1-drops. 8 evasive 1-drops, pretty important. Siren Stormtamer also yeah, does double duty as additional sort of dive down type effects. It can counter things that that target you or permanent you control, and not only spells but also abilities. Keep in mind this can, for example, counter something like a Settle the Wreckage, because Settle the Wreckage targets the player, which is pretty strong and pretty important to know, because that card can otherwise be pretty problematic. And the thing that goes together with these evasive 1-drops and is kind of the heart of the deck is Curious Obsession. The old fish decks back in the day had Curiosity, which was just an enchantment that made you draw a card when the creature dealt damage to the opponent, and Curious Obsession also gives it +1/+1. But at the beginning of your end step, if you didn't attack with a creature this turn, you have to sacrifice Curious Obsession. Keep in mind that any creature is enough. Not the creature with Curious Obsession doesn't necessarily have to attack. You just have to attack with something. So you can, for example, attack and then, for whatever reason, say, for example, you drew into an Obsession post-combat and you have mana to spare, you can just slap it on a blocker, make the blocker a bit better at blocking, and also have the Obsession out for next turn. That won't come up very often, but it's technically a possibility for mana efficiency, for example, to keep in mind. Also, don't play this post-combat in this situation for the same reason. If you didn't attack with anything, just because you forgot and want to be like mana efficient, that's gonna get punished real hard. And yeah, then we have some 1-cost protection spells for Dive Down and 1 Spell Pierce. Dive Down basically counters anything that targets your creatures, which is pretty important, especially to protect your Curious Obsession, carrying units, creatures, and also too much Eternal lately. And also your Tempest Djinn, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then one Spell Pierce, which kind of does the same thing, but is less reliable, but also allows you to stop stuff like Settle the Wreckage, the 5-cost Ras, I forgot the name, and Planeswalkers like Teferi and Braska, and so on. Or like Ritual of Soot. There's a bunch of things this counters. There was a second one in the sideboard, and if you face a lot of spell-heavy, more controlling decks with like a lot of Planeswalkers and stuff, I could definitely see putting a second one in the main deck for best of one. It's probably also quite decent against mono red in the early game when mana is still tight, and also to stop something like Experimental Frenzy later on, but not sure if I would want a second against mono red in general. Dive Down is very good there because it stops their burn spells at any point in the game, which is what matters most. And then as additional 1-cost spell, we have 4 Opt to kind of smooth out our draws, hit our land drops, and yeah, just give us some card selection and also allow us to use our mana if we left open something like Dive Down, Spell Pierce, or any other of our instants and didn't end up using them. Then the other creatures of the deck are for Warkite Marauder, just another evasive threat. It has 2 attacks, so it's a pretty reasonable clock, and the fact that it turns an opposing creature into an 0/1 without any abilities on attack is pretty important. There's a bunch of bigger flyers that this deck otherwise would have issues with, especially the Drakes out of the Izzet decks, or something like Doom Whisperer out of Dimir, and then having a Warkite Marauder out and protecting it makes them incapable of blocking, and makes it much easier for you to make short work of them because they usually cannot race you. This comes up quite a lot, and the ability is much better than it might seem initially. And also the fact that it has flying makes it a decent Curious Obsession carrier, especially in conjunction with the ability, because it's even hard to be blocked by flyers. The opponent needs 2 flyers. So it's pseudo unblockable, just like Mist-Cloaked Herald. Then we have Merfolk Trickster, somewhere between threat and trick. There's a bunch of creatures in the game that you can just kind of randomly ambush and kill with this. Like I killed the Lava Runner out of mono red by using the ability on it. Then it turns from a 2/2 into a 1/2, and then you just eat it for free, or like just eat Llanowar Elves and stuff like that. If your opponent is careless, you can get a bunch of nice things with this. You can also just use this as sort of a trick, like sometimes you want to use this in response to an Explore card, tapping a Wild Growth Walker to deny them the 3 life and the counter to win the race and stuff like that, or just tap down a blocker to get in for 2 damage on your turn with the Trickster. Also the fact that it has flash makes it play really well with your counters, and it's a wizard for Wizard's Retort, which also matters. And sometimes it's just trading on the ground or jump blocking to help you win in the air. And then last but not least, the finisher, the real threat and the other backbone of the deck in conjunction with Curious Obsession, is Tempest Djinn. For triple blue you get an 0/4 flying that has +1/+0 for each basic land you control. So in this deck it's at least a 3/4 the turn you play it, and then it just keeps growing. And yeah, this is kind of like the Drakes, but it doesn't require spells, it requires islands, so it warps your deck less in a way once you look past the color restrictions. And yeah, this is one of the cards that makes the deck possible. And Curious Obsession, without those 2 cards, the deck would not exist. And yeah, the card's really powerful, races pretty well, and yeah, it's usually drawing Obsession or Djinn is what makes your games a lot easier. Without either of those, the games can be really hard and kind of finicky, and you have to hope to get there somehow. Okay, let's talk about the rest of the spells. We have 2 Charter Cores, just sort of as additional card advantage engines, because like I said, you don't always draw Curious Obsession and you might need some extra cards, and the deck attacks a lot, so 2 mana, draw 2 cards, basically 2 mana divination is a pretty good deal. You don't want too many, because they can be a bit situational and a bit dirtly for what the deck wants to do. Card advantage is not that important, which is why there's only 2. The other slots are kind of more important for interacting and having enough threats, but the 2 have played really well, and I wouldn't want to go below them, but I don't really see room for more of those. And then we have for Wizard's Retort, which in this deck most of the time effectively is good old counterspell, so the deck is kind of like 8 flying men and 4 counterspell and 4 curiosity, kind of like in the good old days, the first fish decks back then. Also we're running flying man, curiosity and counterspell, and yeah, we all know how good counterspell is, so good in fact that it is not being printed anymore. That's another one of those cards that gives the deck its strengths. Getting to play cards that are so good that Wizards is not printing them anymore is a pretty good deal. And since you want to be aggressive anyway, and there are a bunch of proactive Wizards, namely Stormtamer and Trickster, having this as a 2-cost hard counter to anything is really, really powerful and allows you to sort of cripple the opposing game plan and protect your own while beating down. And then there's another flex slot, 1 sleep. Sleep is kind of necessary against decks that try and swarm you or like race you, especially the white aggro decks and the Selesnya token decks, which can get out of hand quite a lot and the games can turn into pretty tight races, and then sleep is exactly what you need to finish the race before they kill you. Once again, if in your games you feel like this is not mattering as much, I could see maybe replacing this and maybe even the Force Warkite Marauder with like 2 exclusion mages and trying to play a tempo game that way that has different advantages, or maybe even giving up on it for the second spell pierce to be just more efficient, lower curve, and fight spell heavier decks better if it turns out you don't really need this. So yeah, basically the flex slots are kind of like this, the spell pierce, and maybe the Force Marauder, but I think without sideboard you kind of really want Force Marauder. Marauder has been pretty good against a lot of decks, and it's also proactive, and proactive cards have a much lower chance of being bad or punishing in your deck than reactive ones like Sleep or Spell Pierce, which is why going with 4 Marauders is least likely to go wrong and put you at a disadvantage, because it's still just a pretty cost-efficient evasive 2-drop that attacks, which is what your deck is mainly about. And then we have 20 islands. One note on the best of 1 and the double opening hand situation. I made a video discussing it and also pinned an article by Zvi Moshowitz from Channel Fireball, where he further talks about the impact on the metagame and archetypes and stuff. And yeah, I think in terms of deck building, at least in existing decks, you don't really want to change a whole lot. Sure, you could try and build decks specifically to try and abuse this, like super low curve aggressive decks with like 16 lands that play like they had 18 or 20, for example, that kind of like top out at 2 mana stuff and only have like I don't know, 2/3 1-cost stuff and 1/3 2-cost cards. But in this deck, the 20 land have played really well. I played quite a bunch of best of 1 with the rule, and I can't say I ever felt like I have too much land. Quite the opposite. The deck sometimes still is struggling a bit to find that 3rd or 4th land that you sometimes need to do all your things, and you aggressively opt for it. So I really wouldn't want less mana. All this best of 1 rule really does is make the deck much more consistent, because I think at best of 3 or in paper you would have to mulligan a lot more opening hands due to having not enough land in your opening hand. But with the best of 1 rule, this deck basically almost always has 2 land openers, which is pretty good. You just kind of like gotta make sure that you find that third land for your Tempest Djinn, or like going 1-drop plus Retort, or Retort when you don't have a wizard, for example, or just like turn 3 Obsession with Retort backup and that sort of stuff. So the deck really wants its third land. So it's almost sometimes that getting fewer 3 mana opening hands actually kind of can hurt the deck, but the fact that you also get a lot less 1-land hands makes totally up for it. It just sometimes bottlenecks you a bit more on 2, which is another reason why swapping the Exclusion Mage with Warkite Marauder is beneficial, since lowering the deck's curve mitigates that even further. And consistently having 2 land openers with this deck means you rarely have to mulligan, and the deck plays super consistent. So yeah, all I can say is leave the mana as it is and just enjoy the insanely increased consistency that you get from this rule. And yeah, if this deck gets good opening hands and doesn't have to mulligan a lot, it's a lot better. So I think this deck actually in general benefits significantly from the best of 1 setup with the double opening hand. But we'll have to see how it shakes out in the meta game, how well it does. Like technically, these tempo decks are particularly good at beating mid-range decks because they are kind of clunky and very susceptible to a tempo game plan. Against control, it kind of depends, but I think right now in Standard, a lot of the control tools are kind of expensive and not that efficient, and the more expensive they are, the better it is for these kinds of decks. In something like Modern, tempo decks are usually disadvantaged against hard control decks like Jeskai or Azorius, or like at least at a slight disadvantage, because their early interaction is so universal and cheap and efficient, and then their mid-game is so powerful and the decks are not well prepared for this. But in Standard, they are less efficient and less cheap, and also you have surprisingly good interaction compared to what you would have for these decks in Modern, because in Modern you have to care about other things. And yeah, aggressive decks, it's kind of like also depends a bit, because they can be good against you because they go under you, they are even faster, they are more dedicated aggressive, so some of your reactive stuff, your tricks and counters are not as good. But once again, if you can draw extra cards or just establish a Tempest Djinn and protect it, that can give them real fits and just like stall out their board and everything. So these matchups are quite manageable in theory. I haven't played a ton with the deck lately, so the meta, I'm not sure about what metagame you face depending on your rank and everything, but yeah, all in all the deck's pretty well rounded, and I have been doing well in my game so far, and I just gotta like see how it performs against what you're facing and adjust accordingly. Another big upside of this deck is that it's really cheap. This version has 8 rares, 0 mythics, which is still a big deal in MTG Arena. Sure, cards don't cost money, but you need the wild cards, and this only needs 7 to 8 rare wild cards. If you don't run the Force Marauder, it's even 7 rare wild cards, a bunch of uncommons and commons that you can even pick up in like Dominaria draft and stuff. So a great deck to get started with. Cheap, fun, competitive. What else do you want? And especially for people that enjoy this kind of like old school playstyle and enjoy getting to play with cards that play a lot like old cards that aren't around anymore. A lot of this Standard format kind of feels like a throwback to classic days of Magic, with mono red, white Winnie, mono blue fish, and then like the green black mid-range style deck, which evokes memories of the Rock, the very first prototypical green-black mid-range deck, so to speak, and like blue-white or blue-white X control decks, which are also like very, very old school. Like I think Proto 1 it was won by a blue-white control deck that I think was splashing some red. So Jeskai control effectively. So this whole like Standard meta game is an entire throwback to like old school Magic, which makes this format pretty cool and pretty appealing to a lot of people, I think. Okay, this is the deck. Hope you guys enjoyed it. And as usual, gonna hop into some ranked games and show it in action. 4 to be exact, and show you how it plays out, what to pay attention to when piloting it, and yeah, we'll see how we're doing. That's it again for the deck tech. As usual, before we hop into some games, please hit the like button if you enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification icon to not miss out on future content, and please consider whitelisting YouTube to help support the free content. And of course you can find me on social media and live streaming on Twitch over here and in the description. Alright, on to the games. See you in a moment.